Today is week 4. We have reached the halfway point, and I don't know how I feel about that. I feel like I'm a little sad, but I hope you guys have enjoyed the first 4 weeks, and hopefully you'll enjoy the second 4 weeks. I want to start today with a correction from last week's class, and the reason this correction was brought up was because John, when John was editing the class, he was like, that's not correct. So he emailed me, which I appreciate, but the correction is going to be this right here. Last week the question got brought up about the Macedonian Empire and what country is Macedonia currently in, and we said Turkey. Turkey is not correct. It is actually, it used to be Yugoslavia until recently, so you were right on. It is now the Republic of North Macedonia. So John actually found this map, and it's actually, if you kind of look behind, the red is what the Achaemenid Empire was, and then these are the current countries. So it's kind of hard to see, I know, and I had to kind of stretch it out so it's not really to scale. So if you look on the map and you're like, wow, Amy's map is really distorted, it is, I will admit that. But again, you can kind of see it, it's just right up here. That's where our Macedonian Empire started. Okay. So I want to correct that because I don't want anybody to think that I'm just going to let errors slide when they're brought to my attention. I'm sorry?
Which John gave you the correction?
Morrison.
Okay.
Yeah, and he sent me this slide too. He found this map. And you know how bad I am at finding good maps. So, all right, I have to scoot up. If I scoot up, can you guys still see? Okay. All right, so that was the correction. And then we're going to go ahead and start with our questions for this week. And so our first question is going to be this one. Are Hebrews, Israelites, and Jews the same thing? Are they the same people? So how many people would say no? Raise. You have to participate today. Raise your hands if you say no. Okay, and then raise your hands if you say yes. Okay, everybody who raised their hands, regardless of yes or no, is correct because they are absolutely not the same thing and they are at the exact same time. So we're going to go through and I'm going to explain the differences because that's what I wanted to do. So we start out with our Hebrews. Our Hebrews are our most ancient people of the 3 groups. The Hebrews, there's actually a lot of discrepancies about where the Hebrews came from. Some people, like myself, just assumed it was because they were from the land of Hebron. That is not correct. It's one, I guess, possibility. The biggest possibility is that one of Abraham's ancestors is actually named Eber, and so it was his family. So they were the Hebrews, which then became the Hebrews. There's also some ancient writing in Egypt that there was a group of people called the Hebrons. And so it's kind of a combination of all of those because we obviously know that our Hebrews are in Egypt at some point. And so it's more than likely just that kind of combination. But the Hebrews were a nomadic people. They did not have cities. So keep that in mind. Then, of course, Abraham is going to have Isaac. Isaac's going to have Jacob. Jacob is going to wrestle with God and become Israel, and that's where we're going to get our Israelites from. So after that point, Israel's family is known as the Israelites. The term Israelites does not actually come into predominance until they move into the Promised Land. When they start the monarchy under Saul, that is when they become the kingdom of Israel, and they become even more well known as the Israelite people. And then, of course, we're going to have our Babylonian Empire, which is going to conquer both the lands of, we have our split countries, Israel, Judah. When the Babylonians come in, they're going to first wipe out Israel. So when they do that, all of the people from Israel flee. Most of the people from Israel, even though we've talked about them going to Egypt, we've talked about them going to other areas, most of them go straight south into Judah because they can take refuge with people who are of similar, distant cousins. So we have that happening. So this whole group of people then become known from the land of Judah. They become the Judahites. They, of course, when they're in captivity, they come back in. The only thing that's left is Judah. So when they're there, again, they're the Judahites, and they become known as the Jews. Just to shorten it. But then, because we like to go backwards, and we kind of have to explain how all these people are then interconnected, the Jews can directly trace their line back to Israel. So there's going to be this connection, right? Judah is a son of Israel, of Jacob, so we know that there's going to be this connection. The Israelites then can trace their ancestors back to the Hebrews. But then, because we like to make things even more complicated, we're going to say that Abraham is the father of the Jews. So we're going to have this interconnected. Colloquially today, we just refer to everybody who is from this Semitic religion, Semitic area. We just typically refer to them as Jews. So yes, they are terms that can be used interchangeably depending upon the context. Now, I will tell you this, if you came up to me and told me that Abraham is a Jew and you did not give me any type of context, I would just kindly remind you that Moses didn't kill his first person until he was 40, and I am 40, so you better start backing up. Because it's kind of one of my pet peeves. One of my other pet peeves that I'm just going to share with you is when people use the term Israelite and Israeli interchangeably. Those two terms cannot be used interchangeably today. Yes, if you go back into Hebrew scripture, the word is actually Israeli, but we do not translate it that way. And the reason is because we have a modern country of Israel, and they are the Israelis. So if you are referring to somebody who is an Israelite, it needs to be Israelite. Anybody in the Bible is an ite. Anybody today is an Israeli. So, all right. The next question is going to be, what is the Apocrypha? This was the perfect day to talk about this because today is going to be the day that we actually cover our first apocryphal book. So, how many of you have ever read the Apocrypha? Has anybody read it? Okay, yeah, oh, good. Might come in handy for you. Okay, so the Apocrypha is also going to be the deuterocanonical works. They are 15 books that not all of them are full books. Some of them are just extra chapters of books that we already have in our Bible. And they are going to be non-canonical books or non-canonical. I'm just going to stop trying to say that. Thank you. Books that, or chapters of scripture that are useful for instruction, but they're not in the canon anymore. Please keep in mind that the books of the Apocrypha were originally in the canon. They were in the canon. The Council of Rome voted them in to be part of the Bible in 382. They were not removed from the Bible until Martin Luther actually went through and revised the Bible during the Reformation movement. And that was about 1580 that happened. So for about 1200 years, these books were considered part of Scripture. The reason, we're going to get into the reasons why they were removed. We're going to very briefly touch on it today, and then I have an entire class that's going to be dedicated to all the other apocryphal books that we won't get into as we travel through this. So the biggest thing to remember is that Judaism never considered these books to be part of Scripture. They included them because they are very good books for instruction. They will help you learn things, but they will not necessarily further your steps into the value of the church and further your relationship with God or in some way. So that is why they eventually get removed. The term literally means to obscure or hide away. The Apocrypha, that word is not going to be just based on these books that we're talking about today. Almost every religion in the world has a set of apocryphal books, and they are books that they don't typically introduce to people who are new converts. So think about, like if you were going to be converting somebody, you're not probably going to start with the book of Revelation, right? We're going to start with our very basic text, and then we're going to work our way up into the more difficult text because we don't want to just throw somebody into the wolves. So most religions have a set of books that they set aside and said, really until you get to know us better, until you get to know what we're talking about and who we are and what we're about, we're not going to actually tell you any of this stuff. So this is kind of like putting your best foot forward until you show you're crazy. And not all these books are actually crazy. Most of them are actually very historical and very beneficial. I will make this very clear that I have done a lot of study on this, and I would agree that they should not be included in the canon, but I tend to go back to the Jewish idea that yes, they should not be considered scriptural, but they should be read because you need to understand where things are coming from. And I think, Curtis, you've read it. You would agree that this is where a lot of popular thought is coming from in terms of today. The Catholic Church does still have the Apocrypha in their Bible, but most of the other churches then have excluded it. Orthodoxy depending on what type of Orthodox you are, may or may not have it. The Apocrypha ends up getting removed, and basically why it gets removed, there's going to be 15 reasons. Again, I'm not going to go through them all. They'll be on the slides if you want to reference back to them. But we do see that some of those popular ideas that we have today are found in Scripture. The person gets saved by works, the idea of purgatory, some of these ideas that we hear people talking about, that, there were souls before there, like how Adam and Eve were, you're born, I guess is what I'm trying to say, original sin, that idea. All of that stuff is actually in the Apocrypha. The Archangel Raphael is actually an Apocrypha. We're going to talk about him in a couple weeks. So just keep in mind that a lot of our popular thoughts, a lot of things that are well known today that people will talk about are based in the Apocrypha. It wasn't ever actually included because there are no direct references back to Scripture. They are cited, but they are never said, it is written that. Or so, not cited, that was the wrong word. They're alluded to, but it's never said, it is written that. So we will even have a lot of those repetitive ideas, but because of that, it becomes kind of controversial. There's many, many councils that go on when they're writing the church. And if Jay ever lets me teach the next class that I want to teach, was about how the Bible came to be. And the 2nd century church, which way gets overlooked, and they shouldn't, you'll get an earful about this. But if you go down to number 13, the Councils of Hippo and Carthage, which are going to be our next 2 big groups of people that decide what needs to be included in the canon, both of those are on the fence. And so eventually it's just going to come up with whatever's on the fence. Like, let's just kind of kick it out and let's just say, let's put it aside. Maybe we can reference back to it, but we're not actually going to include it as Scripture. And then Jerome, who's one of our most ancient church fathers, one of our ancient Christian fathers, he actually rejects it. And so again, when we have all this information, it is completely removed from the Bible. And because the Reformation movement wanted to be so absolutely distinct from the Catholic Church, they completely set aside these books, and we just don't even talk about them because we want to be different. Remember, we speak where the Bible speaks, we're silent where the Bible's silent. These books are no longer in the Bible, so we don't even need to talk about them. We don't even need to reference them. So again, the Apocrypha we're going to talk about, there's an entire class, but we will talk about one of the apocryphal books today, and then we're going to talk about several of them next week. All right, so are there questions before we move into the Macedonian Empire? Yes?
What does canon mean?
Canon, the canon is what our Scripture is. So the canon is the combination of all of the books of the Bible that they went through and they voted on based upon different text, how many times it occurred in ancient text. These are actually people who are Catholic. This is when there was one Catholic church. So it's a group of bishops that goes through and they are going to vote. And yes, it's very much like you would see oral arguments in court today. People stood up and said yes, people stood up and said no, and then at the end there was a vote. And there are some books that really only made it in by one vote. And so you kind of have to question whether or not, like those books, like I'll be honest, I have gone through and I've voted because I don't know. Some of them I'm kind of on the fence about. And I did make that mistake once because Jude is one of those books. Like Jude is highly contested whether or not it should be in there. And I don't know if you saw on this slide, but Jude quotes Enoch, which Enoch is not even an apocryphal book, but it is another book at the time. And so we were talking about Jude one week at church, and I can't even remember what I said, but I just made like some off-the-hand comment like, yeah, but should Jude really even be in the Bible? And I was just throwing it out there because I just assumed like everybody had done this self-study. They hadn't. And then I became like a heathen.
Starting as a 2.
Yes, yeah. I started something I did not mean to start, and thankfully we didn't have to finish that. But
You're pretty safe in here.
thanks, I appreciate that. Thanks.
I skimmed a book by Isaac Asimov one time about the books of the Bible.
Yeah.
I don't think he was a believer.
Yeah.
He believed in God, and he came up with about the same books. He apparently went ahead and compared them. And
Yes.
said, well, there are things in the Apocrypha that don't agree with all the other
Absolutely.
books. I was surprised that somebody who wasn't a believer would go to that depth and still come up with the same
Yes.
answers.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, when you actually go through and you see all the arguments and you go through and you do that depth of study to know whether or not you would have included the book in the Bible, it's very evident how God's hand worked in the whole thing. Because, we're talking about centuries of stuff that go on, and it's just amazing how it really is. And just, those nuances and everybody's knowledge is just really incredible. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and then move on to the Macedonian Empire, unless were there any more questions, because I totally cut people off. Okay. All right, so today, remember last week we ended with the Macedonian Empire. We actually finished the Macedonian Empire, but we're just going to recap for people who might not have been here and just hit some of the highlights. When we left off last week, Alexander had just died. He died of this illness that we don't really know what it was about. We know that he probably more than likely was not murdered. And Alexander is going to die with no successor. So when Alexander dies, his wife Roxana is the one that I referenced last week that was from Bactria, which is where we know that the Buddhist monks had already made it to Bactria by this point, and this is why. It's because Roxana is from Bactria. Roxana is pregnant, and they do not know, because obviously this is before the time of sonograms, they don't know if the baby's going to be a boy or a girl. And this is going to determine everything, because if the baby's a girl, we can move on, we can split this kingdom, we can do whatever we want. If the baby is a boy, the baby is the rightful heir of the entire kingdom, even though he's just born. So because Roxana is pregnant, they decide that they are going to appoint 4 generals to assist, and obviously an infant can't necessarily rule an entire empire. Yes. So because of that, they're going to appoint these 4 generals that are going to kind of like co-lead if the infant is a boy. And of course the infant turns out to be a boy, because that's how it would work. If you had your entire empire hinging on something, of course it's going to be a baby boy. So the 4 men who are actually going to be appointed for this are the first 4 right here. Ptolemy, Cassander, Lysimachus, and Seleucids. And what's going to happen is they initially agree that they're just going to keep their parts of the country or the empire, and they're going to keep them safe, they're going to keep them secure. They're not necessarily going to try to expand anything. They're just going to keep them intact so that when Alexander's son, who's also named Alexander, because we don't move far away from any names, he can actually lead. He'll have this entire empire, then he can do with it what he wants. Does anyone think that this is going to work? It absolutely does not work. And it goes down pretty quickly, like within months, it starts going down. So the 2 that we're going to talk about the most are going to be Ptolemy and Seleucus. And the reason is because these are the 2 that are going to have the area where the Jews are. These are the 2 that are going to really determine what's going on in Jerusalem. Just some other notes I wanted to make. Cassander is married to Thessalonique. And he's actually the one who starts the city of Thessalonica, which will come in obviously when we're in the New Testament. And then Epirus, this is actually just a region. And so this one is not a person. So just keep that in mind. There is a different region. And the reason is, again, they have their own kind of generals. Those generals are going to switch pretty frequently. All these people are going to start fighting like crazy. And so it's going to become real interesting real fast. All right, so moving on from that, this is what the map looks like. This is not the map that I showed you last week. And the reason why I didn't show this map, because I actually like this one the best, is because in the entire scheme of the color wheel, I do not know why they picked this shade of blue to go with the Ptolemies when this shade of blue is used for the ocean or the seas. I just feel like it's really hard to see, maybe from a distance. But I did want to just make this distinction because I'm going to blow this map up in a second. Again, just like we said last week, there is no smart way in terms of how they divided this. So some people have some really big cities, so they have a smaller area that they're actually going to rule. Other people have more rural areas, so they're going to get larger portions. No real smart way on how they did it. But this is the area that we're going to focus in on. Remember from this map last week, Jerusalem is Jerusalem. Because again, I'm really bad at finding maps. This one is written in Latin. Okay, so in this right here, this dark blue, that's actually going to be the Dead Sea. So that's the reason why it's a darker shade of blue. There's nothing of significance other than just to note that it's water. So Jerusalem during the Didache. Now, last week I referred to this as the Didache. And so last week I thought, I wonder if I pronounced that correctly. So I actually went through and listened to like 17 videos on how to pronounce it. And what I thought was very interesting was in British English, you were supposed to pronounce this word Didoche. And this was very funny to me because it was kind of late at night. And by late, I mean like maybe 10:30 because I don't stay up late. But I was like, oh, this is perfect because things are okie dokie in the Didoche. And then I decided I needed to just stop and go to bed because it was too much. Okay, so but after all of this, I did find out that I should probably pronounce it Didache, so that's what I'm going to do. So they are so busy fighting each other that they absolutely do not have time to worry about anything that's going on within their borders. So because of that, the Jews are very prosperous during this time. They have peace. They get to do what they want. A lot of the Jews that have gone to Egypt, they are going to absolutely thrive. We talked about that a couple weeks ago when we talked about the temples that are going to get built in Alexandria. There is the idea that Alexander did transport an entire group of people down to Egypt just to kind of help build his economy. There's another school of thought that the people that were transferred were actually Jewish prisoners that then get released pretty quickly after they get there. And we do know that later on, some of the other Ptolemy rulers that come in, they do purposely transport groups of Jews down to Egypt. And so by the time that we have Philo, who's one of our ancient authors that we're going to reference back to, he says that there are nearly 1 million Jews in Egypt. So we know that the Ptolemies are really supportive of the Jews, and we know that they really shelter the Jews, and that they also are going to assist with the building of the Temple of Onias. And we'll talk about that just more here in a second. This is just for reference. This is just back to our map of Egypt during this time. Up here is where Alexandria is. And then our next spot is going to be Heliopolis, which is where our Temple of Onias is built. And down here is where Elephantine is, and that's where our initial Jews went during the Babylonian Empire. So a lot of these Jews that started out in Elephantine, once their temple gets destroyed there, and Alexandria becomes the place of Jewish worship, and that's really the center of Jewish life in Egypt, they're going to start migrating. And so keep that in mind, that our entire Jewish center is going to be moved up. And during our Maccabean revolt, that's going to be very important that we have most of our Jews up here, because our Jews are going to come and assist the Jews that are in Jerusalem. I should really move because I think I'm going to knock over the TV. That's the second time I've hit it. Okay, so our first group of people that we're going to talk about during this time period are the Ptolemies. The Ptolemies are the ones that are going to be in Egypt. They're the ones that are on the blue, so the blue outlines Israel at this time, or Jerusalem rather. They do not have control of Jerusalem, but they do have control of the surrounding areas. So during this time, the Ptolemies, our group of people, they are the first initial group of people who come in and start accepting bribes. So remember, our high priest of the Jewish people is supposed to be a person who is extremely high moral character and high ethical character. And there's a lot of outline in the Old Testament about this is what the high priest does. This is the vestments. These are the priestly acts. These are all these different things. So the high priest at this time is the one who collects all of the taxes. However, during the Ptolemy Empire, they're actually going to say, well, we're willing to accept bribes. And so if you want to be the tax collector, which why anyone would want to do that, I don't know. But people do because it's a status thing. They accept bribes. And so this person named Joseph, who's the son of Tobiah, he gets the appointment to be the person to go in and collect the taxes. And that's going to be a big deal because this is where we're going to start our big fight between the Tobiads and the Oniads. And those are the people that are going to start fighting. And this is eventually what's going to split Jerusalem. And so Zadok, the Zadok people, the family of Zadok, they're the ones that get the high priest. Remember, they're the Oniads. They're the ones that are eventually going to send Onias to Egypt to start the temple there. And the break between the high priest being the person to collect the taxes and it being a bribed position is why tax collectors are so hated and why they never regain any type of status in the New Testament, because they absolutely accept bribes. That's how they get essentially most of their payment. Things will change a little bit in the Roman Empire, but in terms of them being people of good moral character, they don't ever change. And in fact, they get a little bit worse. So true Jews, anybody who's a true Jew, would really want the high priest to collect their taxes, again, because they're held to a higher moral and a higher ethical standard. And one of the interesting things about the Ptolemies is keep in mind that these are not Egyptian people. That is something, especially when it talks about Cleopatra, you'll see this, all these artworks about Cleopatra is this Egyptian princess and all this different stuff. Not even close. Cleopatra has red hair and a huge nose. So, I mean, this is not at all what we're going to talk about. There are some artist renderings of her that we'll show later on. But the one good thing about her is that she is the only person who ever goes into Egypt and tries to befriend the people who are there, known as the Egyptians. Of all the rulers, she is the absolute last one because both of the brothers that she was married to die first. So she's the last one. She's the only one who ever learns their language. And so there's really not a good relationship so much between the Ptolemies and the Egyptians, but there's a really good relationship between the Ptolemies and the Jews. All right, so this is where we're going to start our first book of the Apocrypha. This is not the first book of the Apocrypha if you were to read it, but this is the first one in terms of it being actually the oldest. This book is called Ecclesiasticus, or it's also sometimes known as the Wisdom of Jesus ben Sirach. And it's written by a Jewish scribe named Ben Sira, and his father is Joshua ben Sirach, and it's based upon his life and the things that he experienced during the Ptolemy Empire. And the reason why his name goes from Joshua to Jesus is because during the Second Temple time period, everybody adopts two names. They're going to have a Hebrew name, and they're going to have a Greek name. And so those are the same thing. Joshua in Hebrew is Jesus in Greek. So you can also think about that later on when we're talking about Jesus. So you'll see a lot of this where even if you're reading any type of ancient text, people are known by different names. Also, the last name, depending on where you get it, it can be Sirah or Sirach. So it's the same thing as well. This is just not getting better. Now I just hit this. Okay, but we know about this guy Joshua. We know, his father, Joshua. We know that he goes to Alexandria, but he had lived in Jerusalem. And so when this happens, it's actually late in the Ptolemy Empire. It's written actually during the Seleucid Empire, and then it's going to get translated into Greek later on by his grandson, who's going to include this forward about the book. The book is actually very, very similar to Proverbs. And if you're reading through it, you will notice that it is very similar to Proverbs. There's no other way to explain it. It has all this sage wisdom, sage advice that's being given. Very much similar to like if you were to read Chinese Proverbs. It's very similar. The difference is that it's by one person. We know that our book of Proverbs has several authors. This book has one person and he signs his work, which that is significant because people during antiquity don't sign their works. It's kind of left up to that oral tradition to kind of say this is who said these things, but he actually signs it. And the last book of the text is Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. He is listed as one of the famous men, which has made most people agree that this was not the original ending of the book. The book ended sometime before, but then people thought that this was such amazement of all the things that he was doing that they're going to add him to this list. There are several messianic references in his list of famous men. As you can see, I put on the screen Sirach 47:11. The Lord took away his sins and exalted his power forever. He gave him the covenant of kings and a throne of glory in Israel. And so there are several messianic references, which makes people think that whoever really wrote this book, well, they know who wrote it, but that he really did believe that Jesus was coming quickly, and this was something that they all needed to be aware of. This book, though, has numerous numerous allusions in the book of the New Testament. And the reason is because this book is very popular in Jewish culture at the time. So everybody has read this book, everybody knows what's going on in this book, and it is widely circulated even though it is not regarded as scripture. There are some, and I think I stopped counting at 14, that are literally almost the same thing. And I put one up on the screen. So Luke 152, we have the Song of Mary, and she says that he has brought down rulers from their thrones and has exalted those who were humble, which is almost an exact quotation of Sirach 10:14. The Lord destroyed the throne of rulers and he raised up the gentle in their place. Like, very well known. So it's referenced time and time again. However, in all of the times that it is referenced, it is never said, "It is written that," because they do not consider it scripture. And because of that, again, is why it's going to be removed later on. So this is our first book that we're going to cover. Is this the one that had the picture? Yes. This picture, by the way, this is another one that's distorted, and I just wanted to point this out because I had to kind of blow it up. And when he gets blown up, he looks like he's like 12 foot tall, but he's not. He's actually just a normal size, but I think he kind of looks very large. Like if you look, because he's even bent over, but he's not. So just keep that in mind. My pictures are not great. I steal them all from the internet. Okay, so then when, again, Ecclesiasticus is written during the Ptolemy time, then we're going to have the Seleucids come in. And this is an actual bust of Seleucus, which is our first one. Isn't he shiny? I get so excited every time I see this picture. And I think that if I worked at the museum where his bust was, I would mention his shininess so many times that it would become my job to make sure that he stayed shiny. I'm very distracted by that. Okay, so he is going to be the grandfather of Antiochus. And Antiochus is actually going to be the person that goes and fights the Ptolemies, and he's going to gain control of Jerusalem. And when he gains control of Jerusalem, things start out really well, and they are literally going to change on a dime. So the Jews, actually, they like this idea when he comes in because, again, they have not experienced any fighting. And so everything that has happened to them up to this point, things have been getting a little bit better, right? We see that they went from captivity, they come back in, they're being left alone, they get to do what they want, they're really getting their places in society. Things are getting a little bit better. So they change loyalty very easily. This is going to be disastrous. And if they shouldn't have done that. But of course, hindsight is going to be 2020. The Seleucids are very close to the Tobiads. The Tobiads are Hellenistic Jews. Remember last week we kind of talked about Hellenism during this time. We're going to talk about that again in a second. And then this is where our fight between the Oniads and the Tobiads is really going to fight. And to get there, we're going to talk about this story of actually what happens. So I know again that a couple weeks ago we talked about Onias and the temple of Onias and what happened there. So the story is that we didn't get into that week. Onias III gets summoned to Antioch. Again, Antioch is going to be the capital of where the Seleucids are. And so he gets summoned to go and answer because the Tobiads are making some really poor comments about him, saying all sorts of things that are not true. So to put an end to this, he gets summoned up to Antioch and he's supposed to go and defend himself. Well, when he gets up there, his brother Jason is actually there too. And Onias somehow ends up getting murdered, and Jason steps in again because he is a Zadokite. But the problem with this is he is not in any way, shape, or form pure enough or good enough of any type of level to become the high priest. He meets none of the qualifications to become the high priest, but he has a lot of money. So he comes in and he offers the Seleucids a lot of money. He gets to become the high priest. And this is where we have Onias' son, who's Onias IV. Because of this controversy, he flees to Egypt and he builds his temple there. So we're really going to start having a problem because Jason is not a good person to be the high priest. And no one is really going to start accepting Jason, who is considered Hasidic, which Hasidic just means that these are devout people. They're very pious. They're actually following the Torah. And so because of that, the Jews are going to split even further, because then we're going to have a real big distinction between, are you a Hellenistic Jew or are you a Hasidic Jew? And this is where we're really going to start this discrepancy that's going to eventually become what we like to call the Pharisees and the Sadducees. This is where this is going to come in. So, but it all starts between these two brothers right here. Okay, this is just a picture of the temple of what the Temple of Onias looked like, if you weren't here the week that we covered it. Keep in mind that Jason, because he is Hellenistic, he is really going to start spreading that Hellenistic thought into Jerusalem. He actually goes in and he builds a temple in Jerusalem, or a gymnasium in Jerusalem. Remember what we talked about last week in terms of gymnasiums. These are places where you go in. You don't necessarily have to go to synagogue anymore, because these are your places of learning. This is where you're going to get all of your good information. This is where you really also have to be naked. And this is where we're going to see that now in Jerusalem, amongst the Hasidic, the very pious people, they start performing that reverse circumcision. And then they are going to start, again, really fighting about what are we supposed to be doing. The Jewish men also start wearing hats that are Greek hats, which are apparently, that's a big deal. Like, you shouldn't wear this Greek hat. And that's another big point of contention. So we have the hats, we have the circumcision, and we have a whole lot of fighting that's going to go on. So I know that we heard the bell. So we'll start here next week, because next week we're going to talk about how things are really only going to get worse. Things are really going to start picking up. You know, I mentioned last week we had that snowball coming down the mountain. We're flat out in avalanche mode now. And it's going to be next week that we really start talking about the Maccabees, and the Maccabees are going to start fighting back. And when we get into that, I probably won't have slept at all that week, because the Maccabees get me so excited. Like, I cannot sleep at night just thinking about the Maccabees. It's very sad and very pathetic. I know, I need to get a life. But maybe after class is over. All right, so are there any questions before the end of class? Okay, remember, if you do have questions, though, to let me know, because I think I only have one question for next week. So I need another question, because I need to have 2 per week. Okay, all right, thank you guys. Hope you all have a good week, and we'll see you next week.